Welcome, Troy Onyango, and welcome, Sukiswa Wana. I hope I can see you and hear you. I would like to open the floor. It's yours. Um, Troy, you are still unmuted,
Yeah,
and
can you
yeah,
hear me now? Okay.
yeah, we can hear
Uh,
you.
sorry about that. Hi, everyone. My name is Troy Onyango. I'm the author of For What Are Butterflies Without Their Wings, which is a short story collection that was published by Masobe Books and Jahazi Press last year. Um, yeah, that's really it for me. Is there something you'd like me to add?
Where are you joining us from?
I'm joining you from London, where I currently am. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Um, First, we're still waiting for Sunyati is joining us as well. Um,
Oh,
we're still waiting. We're still waiting for Sukiswa. I can see she should be in. I think she has problems to connecting us
okay.
um,
Has she
because
has she
now.
responded to your message? To your message?
No, but I've seen she joined in,
Okay.
and but the time we're waiting for Sukiswa, maybe tell us a little bit about the title, because when I saw first time the title, I had to read it 3 times actually to understand. Tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about the title first.
The title is one of the things people stop me to ask me about all the time.
Yeah,
Every panel, every event I've done, everyone is always like, "What is it
yeah.
about this title?" Um, the title comes from a short story in the collection, about sibling rivalry, and it's about two, two, two children growing up in rural Kenya, a sister and a brother, and basically, without spoiling it, there's so much grief and there's so much loss in the story. And one of the things that happens is an act of violence where which starts as an act of love, as a sister to a brother trying to give a gift of butterflies to the brother, and the brother destroys these butterflies, and it's such a painful moment in the book. It's such a painful moment for me
Mm,
when I wrote it. I was like, what kind of cruelty is this, and how did I even come up with this kind of thing? But butterflies, I think the reason why I chose it to be the title of the book, it encompasses the spirit of the book. There's so much beauty, and butterflies are always associated with their wings, but no one ever cares to think, okay, what is a butterfly really outside of that beauty that we see?
yeah.
And so for me, that was where the title came from. The idea that we see a lot of things on the surface, we see a lot of things without really interrogating why they are the way they are, and what will happen if the biggest component of them, even for us, what
Mm,
will happen if the biggest component of our existence will be taken away. And that's how
yeah.
I arrived at the title.
Mm.
Yeah.
Interesting, interesting.
Yeah.
So there's a book with short stories. How many short stories are in the book?
There's 12 short stories, a dozen short stories.
Mm-hmm.
And initially, it was meant to be 18 short stories. That's what I sent to my publisher. And my publisher was like, no, 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 no. We only publish 12 short stories. And, it was a very painful process choosing, quote unquote, my favorites. It was a process of thinking. But it wasn't even about my favorites, because there are stories that I've written and I've published that I think are my favorites, and they didn't make it into the collection. It was about looking at which stories link together, which stories um, share the same themes, which stories can sit next to each other without really conflicting, and which stories are almost set in the same, you know, um,
Mm,
quote unquote universe. Because there are stories I've written that are set in London, there are stories that I've written that are set in Dar es Salaam and Kampala as well. And it got to a point where we were like, why don't we limit it to stories set in Kenya, first of all, and then explore now the thematic concern. So a lot of the stories deal with loss, longing, loneliness, and in a way, you know, what ties all the stories together is love. In as much as there's so much loss and there's so much longing and there's so much loneliness, love is still something that is a thread that goes through the all the stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the meanwhile, I see James' camera is on.
Yeah.
Maybe he can
Yeah. Maybe he
unmute.
can
Eh?
he can come in and we can have a conversation.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, James. Yeah, I
Yes.
can hear
Yes,
you.
James, we can hear
How are
you.
you?
But I know you can't see me. I've just realized. Give me one small second. I get a light. Huh?
Yeah, that's all right. That's all right. Oh, yeah.
So maybe while we're waiting for the light, will you also read us extract from the book, from one of the stories?
Um, yeah, I I always struggle with choosing which story to read from.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to read from a story that someone messaged me today and said, literally sent me a DM on Instagram and said, "How could you break my heart like this?" And I was like, "I don't even know this. I don't even know this person." And they asked me if I interviewed them before writing the story, and I was like, "No, I what do you mean?" And they said, "Oh, this story is the story of my love life." And I was like, "Is your love life this dark and tragic?" And they were like, "No, no, no, not that tragic, but almost became that tragic." And I was, wow. So my
Okay.
fiction is someone else's reality. So let me read Origami.
Yeah. Or what is the
Um,
name to tell the story?
Origami. The story is
Origami.
yeah.
Yes.
It
Yeah.
seems to be the most impacting short story in the collection. People tend to um, start conversations around it. It seems to be the most polarizing story. It seems to be the story that leaves people with a lot of questions. So I'm going to read Origami. First, he plucks a small part of himself and folds it into half, folds it again into a trapezium and presses it down. Then he pinches the longer edge and pulls the insides outwards, leaving him exposed. He folds and unfolds, inwards and outwards, until he is a beautifully shaped thing that is half formed when looked at from the sides, but complete when looked at from the top. No one ever looks from the top. In the end, he hands it over to the lover, a gift to the person his fist-shaped heart has taught him to love. He has fallen in love in the way people make paper into origami, slowly, beautifully, with hands full of paper cuts. He watches the lover fiddle with it, fingering it curiously, turning it over, upside down, in an attempt to figure it out. What exactly is it? And he lies there, waiting for something. But once again, the lover has forgotten to give something in return. He props himself up on the bed, tucks his hands under his head like a pillow, and watches the lifeless ceiling with shadows from the fluorescent light bulb. He wonders what specifically it is that he likes about this person whom he cannot, whatever he tries, get to love him back in equal measure, if anything of that sort exists. Perhaps it is that the lover is beautiful, with turmeric colored skin, or maybe because they speak Lingala with a French suffused accent. Is it the other way around? Or even that they have shown him affection in ways no one has before. They are both silent. There are songs in his heart he cannot remember, as if they are the keys to a lost door. I'll stop there.
Okay. Think up my camera. So now I'm back in. Yeah. Thank you. I'm still. Oh, I think James is gone again.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Good. maybe I'm not really prepared for an interview to interview you, but
I
we try to
can
make our best
I can
best of it.
imagine. I don't know where Kiswa is. I don't know where James is.
Yeah,
So we'll just have to make do with you, unless you want to open the floor to questions.
yeah.
Um,
No, comment a little bit on the story itself you just read, maybe.
um, Origami is a story that um, it took me about a year and a half to write. It took me a long time to get it right. It's a story that came to me with its answers ready, and I had to ask myself questions. I had to, I had to prod the story and think, what happens if something like this is explored in a different way? Um, and basically, the story is about unrequited love. It's about someone loving too much and someone else loving, I don't want to say too little, but differently, and kind of just the miscommunication that can happen in spaces where we think love should thrive, but then it's actually where love goes to die. And so for me, the I remember writing the story and thinking, okay, I have this draft, but it feels incomplete. What if I wrote something around something as sinister and something as violent and something as brutal as rape, and remove the gender? Because rape 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 is a lot of about gender. It's a lot about power. So what happens when we kind of defamiliarize these things? How then do we still look at it? um, and to go into a space where I wanted to write um, you know sexual assault in that way, and to think about it in, I remember at that time I was researching a lot around origami and how to make paper boats and how to make kites, and I remember just thinking, this this all this all comes together. um this all comes together. How do I bring one component of something that is so terrifying and one component of something that is so beautiful, and mix them into a story? And that's literally how origami came about. um I played around with it. So the story takes a very strange form, in that it starts exactly where it ends, but at the same time, so much has happened. And I try to play around with time. So almost in a way that when trauma occurs, people interpret time differently. So I was like, okay, so this trauma has happened. How do we play with time? I don't know if anyone has seen the musical A Strange Loop, and kind of how, and someone has already asked about the 3 years, and I wanted to play with the number three, and I wanted to play with the passage of time. So a lot of time passes, but at the same time it feels like everything is happening contemporaneously. So it feels almost as if everything is happening in real time, while at the same time a lot of time has passed. So in that way, I kind of just went into the story and was like, okay, this is something traumatic, this is something beautiful. How am I going to have fun with both of these elements?
Hi,
That's how
can I
origami. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. My light is now working. So I
Yeah.
have a question that, one of the things I don't see a lot in our writing, in contemporary writing, is disability. And
Yeah.
one of your stories really centers the disability of one of the main characters. I wanted to know why you picked this kind of topic. Is this something that you think about, or it was just a topic you just picked?
So first of all, that story is probably the story that took me the longest time to write. I wrote it over 2 years. And I remember when I first wrote it, this person, Evans, in the story, could walk and all of that. And it almost had different concerns about its conflicts. And I remember at that time, thinking a lot around a cousin I grew up with who, was confined to a wheelchair. And I remember thinking, how come we never think about the sex lives of disabled people? How come we never think about, their desires? How come we never think about what they want, and if they have kinks, and if they have fetishes, and if they have just as an elaborate sex life as we all do. And I remember going back into the story and excavating the flesh of it and remaining with the bones, which was someone trying to get a date on a hook on a hook up. I don't even want to call it a dating app. Someone's trying to get, to get laid, basically. And I remember saying, okay, you know what, let me put this person. And in a way, it fits with how I write my stories. A lot of my stories always start with a very unassuming conflict, but the complication comes in when I decide to think, okay, but what if this story is not Deathless and it's James's story? What if this story, and that's how I complicate my work. I look at who is at the margins. I look at who is almost ignored by society. I look at that person who we never think about their desires, because at the end of the day, stories are about desires, stories are about needs, stories are about wants. If you have a story that doesn't have a desire, that doesn't have a central need, then it doesn't move. It's the need, it's the main character's desires, it's the main character's needs that propels the narrative. And so for me, getting into the story and thinking, oh my God, this is the need, this is, how do we complicate this need? Oh, it's somebody who cannot, do this and this and this. It's almost like growing up, we always used to, when they hung food at the roof so that the cat does not get to it. And we always used to be told, what if, someone who doesn't have legs wants to get to the food? And that's kind of how I started thinking around my stories. I'm like, okay, the food is already there. This person wants the food, but they cannot reach the food. How do we complicate that? And so that for the longest time has been how I structure my narratives. And the way my stories differ is that I look at these people differently. I'm like, okay, so we have a woman dealing with the loss of a child, but what if we made her older? What if we made her this? What if we made the child almost resurrect and stuff like that? And so that's kind of how I came to think about having a disabled person as a central character. It's a very meaningful story for me because I remember when it was shortlisted for the Caine Prize, and someone wrote to me and told me in their 27 years of being alive and reading, they've never read someone like them in their work. And I think that's the work of literature. That's what we do as writers. We hold that mirror and we want ourselves to be seen. We want ourselves to feel seen. And if I can make even just a single person feel seen in my work, then that's all the impact I aim for.
You mentioned that when you were selecting your stories, you wanted them to be more, like some of the stories that are close about the people who are based in Kenya. You have stories that are covering many things. But one of your characters is actually an Indian character. I mean, he flies back home after the death of his parents.
Yeah.
And I wanted to find he's a man who's in India, and he suddenly. Is there a huge Indian community in Kisumu, and what was the reason for that?
That's another story that started very differently, and I like where it is now, just because it's one of the stories that I'm like, when you feel like you landed the climax of the story, and I feel like I really nailed the climax of that story in my head, at least. I don't know how the readers feel, but growing up, we always had a huge Somali community, Indian community, and I remember having friends from all these backgrounds, but that kind of diversity was never seen in Kisumu fiction. I read short stories about Kisumu, and I never see that kind of interaction. I see it in Parklands, and I see it in Westlands, and I see it in, High Ridge, and all these stories that are centered around those places. But I wanted to kind of think about, outside of Nairobi, how do these races, different races, interact? And Kisumu has one of the biggest Indian communities probably in Kenya, because I think even my member of parliament, Shakil Shabir, for the longest time, was, I don't know if he's still the MP, but that was my member of parliament for the longest time. And so it was a question of, how do I bring this person, back to his identity, back to himself, in a way that he allows him to interact with the environment, and allows us also to play with the concept of race. At some point, there are kids who call him Muzungu, which is a white person, and just show how race is a construct. If you're pale skin in certain contexts, you get called white. If you're pale skin in certain contexts, you get called black. If you're pale, so that story allowed me to play with things like that. It allowed me to play with Luo mythology around the whirlwind. We always believe that if you cover a kalausi, a whirlwind, with a basin or a bucket, then you'll find a big snake. And so for me, just being able to get to a point where I can again play around in my fiction with elements that I've experienced in real life, play around with things like race in Kisumu, where people just never think about race. Nobody thinks, oh my God, Kisumu, but it's also just as racially complex in a way as Nairobi is.
There's something, when somebody read your book, a friend of mine read your book,
yeah,
and they were like, okay, listen, a lot of these stories are about love, but they're not about the normal heterosexual love that we're used to. They bend. There's gay, there's trans, and the question I have for you on that is, how are you able to get this book to have traction on the continent right now? Because as much as we like to claim we are liberal, we're in a very weird situation where, if you wrote that story, didn't you expect a bit of a pushback, or you just wrote your book and moved on with your life?
I think at the core of it, these are human stories, and that's probably why people are able to relate with them. At the core of it, I just wanted to explore the human condition. Sexuality is just one aspect of our being. It's not the entirety of human existence. And so for me, I wasn't worried at all about pushback. I say, listen, if it's published, it's published. My stories have been floating around the continent for the longest time. This collection was about 6 years cumulative of work, and in between that, I'd been shortlisted for awards. I'd been, published in various magazines and journals, and my work had been, very public. So all the book did was almost codify the work and also introduce new work, because there's short stories here that I'd never published before. And so in that way, I wasn't worried about any pushback, because I was just like, these are stories. These are human stories. These are fictional stories. Yes, they might be stories about, they might be stories about real life, but at the end of the day, the characters in these stories are not real people. I might have borrowed elements from my life. I might have borrowed elements from other people's lives. But at the end of the day, there's no single person who has lived anything I've written in this. They might have had a similar experience. They might have had the same experience in a different, location. But at the end of the day, there's no one who is ever going to experience what Rhoda experiences in the Transfiguration. That's a whole made up story. There's no one who is going to experience what goes on between Fidel and Castro. That's a made up story. So I think, as a writer, if you just think, okay, number one, this is fiction at the end of the day. Number two, you're writing human stories. That is how someone will pick this book up in like Bulgaria and send me an email and be like, oh my God, I relate so much to your work. And I'm like, how are you able to relate to work that doesn't even center you? But we need to always remember that the human condition is a universal one. The way we experience loss is the same. The way we experience grief is the same. The way we experience loneliness there might be variation, there might be slight variation, but at the core of it, these are all, human emotions that we all experience. And so as long as this book explores that, I don't think there needs to be any reason for any pushback.
A quick follow-up to that. Now that the book is out, how is the book done? I mean, have you done healthy sales? Has it been well? Amasobe Books, are they happy with the sales of the book?
The book has been well received. The book has surpassed my expectations. The book, in all honesty,
Jahazi Press as well.
Yeah, there's always that part of you that thinks, okay, you know what, I'm good, and the fact that my work is being published means I'm good enough for that. But there's also an aspect of you that say that here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. You've gone off a bit.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you with background music.
Okay. Sorry, I think I lost my connection to my headpiece. I don't know. Just give me 1 second to reconnect.
So maybe I can choose the break to ask all the audience. We have 21 people. Please write on the chat your questions, and first of all, write us, where are you joining us from which country, from which city, and welcome Sukiswa.
Guys, I am so sorry. Really, technology failed me dismally. One, my alarm didn't go off. Two, everything that could go wrong today went wrong. And I really sorry. Sorry that left. Sorry, everybody. Troy, I am so sorry. And let me show you my laptop. When I tried to log in using my laptop after you called me that left, this is what it gave me. It's apparently loading right now. Zoom updating.
Hey, Zooks.
Hey, sorry, man, dude.
Hey,
I'm so sorry.
It's all right. Listen, African
Have you read
problems, African
we starting now?
solutions. African problems, African solutions. Don't worry.
So, but please don't forget to write, where are you joining us from? We would really like to know which countries do we have in our Zoom meeting today.
Yes, I already did my reading. Jemo was kind enough to moderate. I don't know if you can hear me clearly.
Thank you, James.
Yeah.
We can hear you very clearly.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
So I already read from Origami, and yeah, we were just talking about the stories.
Okay.
Yeah.
James, shall I leave you to go on?
Hello?
Since I don't know what questions you asked. James, shall I leave you to go on since I don't know what questions you asked?
Yeah, I'm happy to continue. Start video.
All right, please do. I'm so happy. Okay.
The question I had actually for Troy, because we're going to be doing one or two questions here. Sorry about that. I actually put off my video when I saw you.
It's okay.
Yeah, so my question was this.
Yeah.
Now that your whatever has been, you said that your book has been well received. You actually didn't finish that thought. You just said that I was talking about.
Yes, and then I lost my connection to my headset. Yes, I think the book has surpassed my expectations. I think like I was saying, there's always a part of you as an artist, as a writer, where you think, okay, you know what, I'm really good at what I do and blah blah blah. But there's also a part of you, and I think, you know, we need this part that humbles you. That's like, oh, but you're not as good as so, and you're not good enough for X and Y, and you're not, you know, you didn't even win X and Y award, and blah 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 blah. And so for me, before the launch of the book, the side that was almost like you're not good enough was about to win, and was so strong and was so overwhelming. And I said, at some point I resigned myself and I said, listen, even if this book sells one copy, I'll be happy with it as long as it's published. Even if it's my mom in Kisumu who buys that one copy, of course I didn't want it to be my mom. But like even if it's just Jemo who buys it in Nairobi, I'll be very happy with it. Which was a good place to get to, I think, because it prepared me almost for the worst case scenario. You know, I didn't expect Jahazi Press. Sorry, Gabriel. Hi. Are we able to ask Gabriel to mute her mic?
Gabriel, you won't mute. Okay.
Okay. And so I've been really happy with how well it's done. You know, obviously it hasn't sold 1 million copies or anything. But at the same time, I think sometimes art travels in a very strange way. You know, there was a time when there was so much conversation around the book, and then it fell silent, and then I was like, oh, people have stopped reading my work, people have moved on to something. And then recently, I don't know what happened, but there's just been a surge where every time I go online, there's someone talking about the book, there's someone, you know, posting a photo of the book, there's someone telling people to read the book. And so I am just grateful to get to this point. I'm very grateful to get to a point where my work is finding its people. I'm someone who believes, you know, art finds its own people. Not everyone needs to read the book. Not everyone needs to access the book. You know, there's stories in here that are only accessible to Kenyans. There's stories here that are only accessible to Africans. And I think, you know, stratifying my art, and there's stories here that are only accessible to people in Kisumu. And so when I meet someone from Kisumu and they're like, I saw what you did in that story, I'm like, yes, exactly. You know, and for me, that is the success of the art. You know, the messages that I get from people telling me, you know, before this book, I hadn't seen myself in fiction. Before this book, I hadn't, you know, seen someone write about people like me. That is all the validation I need. I think awards are nice, bestseller lists are nice, but that's not your purpose as an artist. You know, your purpose is to write as truthfully and as honestly as possible, to write the stories that hold meaning to you, and to be able to get to a place where you can look back at your work and say, listen, I did a good job. And that's exactly where I am with this book. Not generally as an artist, because there's still almost a higher purpose.
I think you're underrating yourself though, Troy, because I do each and stories.
Sorry?
I said, I think you're underrating yourself though, because with each and every one of these stories, even though it might be set in Kisumu, even though it might be set in Nairobi, and you know, you have honestly managed to make the very personal, the small, universal.
Yeah.
You know, and large and you know, worldly. And I think that's what generally is the mark of a good story, when we can empathize, sympathize with somebody that possibly we don't know, but they start mattering to us from the beginning. Until in the beginning we're like, okay, a story, and then in the end we're like, oh my God, I hope this doesn't happen again. So I think maybe you're under even saying that, or there are only certain stories that only like Nairobians or Kenyans or Kisumites can find themselves in.
Yeah. And I think, for me, I'm happy when my stories are universal. I'm happy when people read these stories and they're like, oh my God, I identify so much with that. But at the same time, as a writer who is concerned with the micros, the daily vagaries of life, I don't even know if that's what to call them. I have tried writing stories that concern themselves with, colonialism and, the bigger picture, the war, blah, blah. And I don't think I'm always successful in those stories. I'm successful in writing stories about how is Zukiswa interacting with Troy? What are the small tensions that go into daily life that, cumulatively make the bigger stories of life. And so when you write such stories, you don't normally expect people to be like, oh my God, I identify, because you've literally niched your story all the way down. So people are like, oh yeah, but I'm not this, but I'm not. And so for me, when people come to me or when they message me or when they email me and they're like, oh, I identify with this story, I'm like, wow. But that's not what I set out to do. For me, I set out to tell stories, about these people who I think to me are on the margins. I think, we don't think about queer people enough. We don't think about disabled people enough. We don't think about trans people enough. We don't think about, older women and their sexual desires enough. We don't think about them enough. And so for me, bringing them into my fiction is just a way to say, listen, you need to think about these people as often as you think about yourself. And if in that way people are then able to come to my work and say, wow, I really identified with that, then all I can have is gratitude at that point as an artist. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. You talked about the writing specifically. So
Yeah.
I know you're a more of a holistic artist. You're an editor. You have this magazine called Lolwe.
Yeah.
Now you've opened a bookstore called Lolwe. You're
Yeah.
doing creative workshop. I'm sure I'm sure you're planning a way of taking over the world somehow. How does it all feed into the writing you're doing?
The first thing for me is I don't rush my writing. I don't put pressure on my writing. I don't put financial pressure on my writing, and I think it's very liberating. And it's a very privileged position to get to, where I can say, oh, my writing doesn't have to make money. Like, it would be nice for it to make money. But, I have a 9 to 5, which I do, very faithfully, and that pays my bills in London, That law degree has to be put to use. And so for me, getting to a point where I'm able to do all these other things, it feeds into my practice in the way that when I edit short stories at Lolwe, when I edit essays at Lolwe, when I read through that stuff, that is me exercising my muscle. That's me. Number one, I'm able to read and read and read and read and never stop reading. And for a writer, reading is very important. It's how you absorb the world. And then it's almost like input, output, input, output. And so for me, just being able to be in a position where I read work and I develop work and I curate work and publish work that, for me represents some of the finest writing on the continent at the moment. It's a privilege. It's an honor. It's a position that I'm envious of myself to be in. And that feeds into my practice because it's almost like I'm going to the gym, to exercise these muscles. And so when I come to my own writing, I'm very aware, I'm very cognizant of like, oh, where do I put the comma? Where do I put the full stop? How does this sentence flow? What is the syntax? How do I, and that's how it fits into it. Being able to, I have a bookstore in Kenya and I have a bookstore now in the UK. And just being able to be around books and be able to sit down and be able to know what book currently people are reading and blah, 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 allows me to also reflect on the commercial viability of my work. It allows me, in as much as I'm not going to set out to write commercial work, but it allows me to think about, oh, how do people conceive or receive the work after it's been published? when someone comes and tells me, "Oh, I'm looking for that middle-aged woman book," I'm like, "Oh, which book is that? Could it be Season of the Crimson? Could it be no? Could it be this?" But you see from there, I'm like, "Oh, so this is what people think about the story. Oh, I'm looking for that transgender book, or I'm looking for that, Kenya village setting." That's kind of how people conceive work. And so in a way, it almost feeds into my consciousness. And when I produce work, then I'm able to sit down with all these, variables and all these variations of what I know, what I've learned about the book writing and the book publishing process, and be able to say, okay, so this is the information I have, this is how I process it.
I'm very happy to hear that you have a 9 to 5. You're not selling chapatis in London.
I wish I was selling chapatis in London.
What is next from you? Yeah. So what is next? Are you coming out with a new book, or we are still now this one only?
Like I said, I don't like putting pressure on my writing. When it comes, it comes. I really admire writers who are able to take 10 years between books. I'm hoping I will not take 10 years between the books, but I'm currently working on a novel. I'm playing a lot in the novel. I'm enjoying writing it. I'm experimenting a lot. It's something that, I've always wanted to do. And in a way, I'm a very, I don't know how to say it. I'm a very formally inventive writer. I don't, I will not send you a short story in the format of a bank account statement. I will not send you a short story in the format of a WhatsApp chat or something like that. But, something like origami, it allows me to experiment a lot. Something like, This Little Light of Mine, it allows me to experiment a lot. I've sat in forums where people talk about This Little Light of Mine, and they're like, is it a man or a woman? And for me, even that is experimentation in a way, because it leaves you with a lot of questions. And it's like, how would you read the story differently if you knew that this was a man? And how would you read it differently if you knew this was a woman? And how would you read it differently if you realized this was a trans person or a non-binary person? But also, why would it matter? And why would it change your reading? And that's my way of experimenting. If I can play around with elements like time, in origami, the 3 years keeps coming up, but it's like, do you know if this story is happening presently or this story happened, 3 years ago? How do you perceive of it if it's happening now, or how do you perceive of it if it happened 3 years ago? And so that is kind of my way of experimentation. And so for me, going into my work, I want to be able to play around with time and language and be able to, just play with character as well and style, and just be able to get to a point where I'm very comfortable with all the elements of fiction and I can manipulate them as much as possible. I think, knowing myself, for me to be able to master all those things, I need to give myself time. I need to allow my art to breathe. I need to allow this to travel to as many readers as possible through its own journey, while at the same time cultivating a practice that allows me to produce the best version of my work at the time. So it's not going to be the best or the great African novel. No. If it becomes that, then well and good. But at the same time, my practice is this the best version of the work that I've produced at this point?
I'm going to ask, I know people have questions, so please, our host, I want you to read any questions that are for the audience. But as we read those, I mean, you came to the African literary space in the last 7-8 years.
Yeah.
How do you see this place going? Are you optimistic? Are you looking like it's a place that will be growing, or are you not very optimistic?
I would say I am cautiously optimistic. If that's a good place to be in. So I am optimistic. Definitely, I am optimistic. But it comes with caution. I think the writing that's coming out of the continent right now is so exciting. It's so it explores different themes. It's very diverse. It's very beautiful. Everyone is playing around. Everyone is experimenting. Everyone is pushing the boundaries. But the reason why and this is where my pessimism comes in, is, the publishing industry is still placing all these expectations on the African book. And it's like, these are 10 years ago expectations. Why are we still expecting books by African writers to be like this? And, there's nothing wrong in writing poverty, poverty stories, and there's nothing wrong in writing, war stories. These are also our realities as Africans. But I am very much in that space where I'm like, why are these the stories that are being given priority? After George Floyd, all the novels that were coming out were about, race and how people are interacting with, race. And every novel that was just coming out was about race. And I was like, okay, cool, we get it. Let's just, nobody's saying don't publish this stuff, just a bit more diverse stuff. And when you market it as, what it is. Stop trying to market a book about, two people falling in love as this, great political something commentary on the state of Kenya or Nigeria or something. And so I'm very optimistic about the writing. I'm very pessimistic about the structure. The infrastructure is not responding fast enough to the writing that is coming out. I look at a space like Lolwe and I'm like, we need 100 more Lolwes. Like, literally, I'm not even exaggerating. Like, I look at the American, just the magazine publishing market, and I'm like, those people have more than 10,000 literary journals alone, and they don't even feel like it's enough. Every day there's like 10 new literary journals coming out. But within Africa, once we have Lolwe and we have Doek and we have Isele and we have Bakwa and we have, Agbo and we have, then everyone feels like that's enough. But if that's enough, then why is Lolwe still overwhelmed with submissions? Why are we still getting 700 to 1,000 submissions for every issue we open? We need more outlets. We need more spaces where people can say, okay, if I don't get into Lolwe, I'll get into Agbo. If I don't get into this, I'll get into this. And just have as many options as possible so that there's so many stories coming out. And out of those stories, then the best of the best will float to the top. And that's what I'm always telling people. If you are a writer and you only concern yourself with the writing and you don't build community and you don't build infrastructures, then when you publish your work, who will read you? How do you expect people to just wake up and say, oh yeah, well, we are going to read? As an African writer, I'm sorry, but we don't get the luxury to just write. You have to concern yourself. If you cannot build something, then support the existing structures. If you cannot, if you cannot start your own literary magazine, email Agbo and say, hey, are you looking for interns? Are you looking for, email Isele and say, hey, are you looking for, guest editor or something like that? So that in that way, you're also contributing to the ecosystem, such that when your writing comes in, then there's a pipeline. But at the moment, the writing is a lot, and it's really good that we are getting a lot of writing currently from the continent. But who are the literary agents? Who are the publishers? If not Masobe, Wida, blah, blah, that's it, where will your book get published? Okay, let's say Masobe picks up your book. Who is marketing the books? Okay, let's say you have a good social media presence. Who is getting the book to the bookstores? How is that book getting to Namibia? How is that book getting to Central African Republic? You need to ask yourself those questions. So it's not enough to just say, okay, I'm writing these stories and that's it. You need to get to a point where you're thinking about the structures as well and the infrastructure. And that's where I'm very pessimistic. I'm very optimistic about the writing. I'm very pessimistic about the infrastructure. People are not building it.
That is good. Cautiously optimistic. Detlef, maybe you want to read some of. Oh, I'd also like to say, just briefly, Benjamin Zephaniah has just passed away. May he rest in peace. Detlef, you want to read the questions?
Yes,
that have been coming
there,
in?
yes, there is the first question from TJ. Troy, thank you so much for talking about how the stories were selected. I'm curious, since your stories occur in the same country, do they occur in the same universe, in the same world? You can unmute yourself, Troy. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I have stories in the collection that occur in the same universe, but I have stories in the collection that don't occur in the same universe. Yes, they're set in the same country, but they don't occur in the same universe. I think the stories that are closest to each other in terms of the universe where they occur is This Little Light of Mine and Origami. I think those are, even the tone, I was very deliberate about. It's almost like a sequel or like a prequel or something. But I was very deliberate about how I wanted them to be read, and I'm glad they both made it into the collection. And a lot of people have made the connection between the stories. There's no clean connection. It's almost like Toni Morrison's trilogy of novels, where you just know it's a trilogy because of the mood and the language style and blah blah blah. And so Origami and This Little Light of Mine almost have a mirror effect to each other in that way. But the rest of them, some of them do occur in the same universe, some of them don't. I think the one that's most far removed, both geographically and also um, in terms of the universe it takes place in, is the March. And that was I think it was one of those stories where we almost didn't include it in the collection, but it made it because of certain thematic concerns that we were like, okay, this actually fits into this. But yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks, Stephen.
Then we have another question from Karen. It's actually two questions. Can I ask about the 3 years mentioned by the lover towards the end of Origami? I didn't get it. Did he lose 3 years of time? And also, what's the process that goes into writing about rape from the perspective of the observer, no, sorry, abuser?
I think I've already talked about the 3 years.
Mm.
It's in so many ways. So, it's trauma, how trauma creates a time split, and how people respond to different traumatic events, and how, I, it's interesting because in this scenario, it's trauma from the trauma as being seen from the abuser's side. And this is not to give power to stories by abusers. This was just a way of looking at it as something so vile. Rape. I always say, rape and murder is almost like, okay, cool, the person is dead. But with rape, someone has to live with it, and there's such a big chunk of life that is taken away from the person. And so for me, it was just a way of almost exploring this vile act in a way that is like, oh, you have to live with this thing that you've done. You have to, almost like, this is the day of reckoning, and you have to live with the consequences of your actions. And in that way, that was why I was like, let me invest this and see what happens in this way. It was it's probably the most difficult story I wrote. Yeah, it's actually the most difficult story I've ever written, ever. I used to think Little Daju was difficult, but I think Origami is probably the most. Both, if you look at the subject matter, the style, the way I had to remove the gender, so we don't really know what the lover is, and also just the time loop that I had to play with. I don't know if I've mentioned that already, but yeah, I don't know if that answers both questions. But in terms of the 3 years, if you read it very patiently, the 3 years will reveal yourself to you, in the way that you will be able to sequence the events. But the secret to it is to look at it as the story begins exactly where it ends.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Another question. We have a question from Linda.
Yeah,
I noticed there was so much there in the stories, possibly half of them. Uh,
yeah.
was that a deliberate theme in the book?
It wasn't. So a brief, detour. I grew up with my great grandmother. Um, my formative years until I think I was about the age of 9. I lived with my great grandmother. And when you live with someone, when you live in an African setup, when you live with someone at that apex, at that point, there's there's so many people, and where there's so many people, there's so much death. And so, as a kid, there was always death around me. There was always someone dying. My great grandmother had a large family, and so there was always so much. And even the stories they told every time when you sit with older people, as a child, all they talk about is, oh, so and so has died. Oh, so and so's child has died. Oh, so and so's wife. And so for me, that really shaped my idea around death. The positive side, it made me not scared of death. It made me think of death as just something people do. People just do this thing as called dying. On the negative side, it made me very preoccupied with the idea of death, and it made me preoccupied with the idea of loss, and it made me preoccupied with the idea of grief. But it didn't make me preoccupied with it in the idea of the person who's died, but the people who are left behind. And so even when I started writing, a lot of my stories were around how people deal with loss and how people deal with grief and how people, and so it wasn't, I think it was my publisher who first pointed it out and was like, okay, these stories are mostly about death. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. I guess that's what I've been preoccupied with for the last, 2 decades of my life. And
Okay.
so no, it wasn't deliberate, but it's because of the fact that, death and conversations around death seeped into my consciousness as a child and growing up. And so just being able to be around death. I'm one of those people, if people talk a lot about something, and I think most people are this way. When people talk about something a lot, then you almost also start talking about it in that way. And so yeah, that's where my preoccupation with death in the collection
Yeah.
comes about.
And do you think it was maybe affected by the period of COVID as well?
No, most of these stories were actually written way before COVID.
Mm.
I don't even think there's a story here that was written during COVID. I think This Little Light of Mine was published during COVID, but a lot of these stories had been finalized during COVID. The stories I wrote during COVID didn't even make it into the collection.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
good. We
Yeah.
have we lost James, but he is coming back again. There is
Yeah.
another question from Renee. Um, you write the human conditions really well, especially the emotional aspect. I could feel Rhoda's longing, uh, the grief in the color of absence. I could go on and on.
Yeah.
And now, sorry, and now I lost the text. Sorry, I lost the text. I could go on and on. Yeah, now the question, how were you able to achieve this in your collection?
Um, Different writers have different beginning points to their stories. A lot of my stories start with an emotion. I
Mm.
think of something like loneliness or you know joy or something, and I'm like, oh, how would how would I explore this in my work differently? And so for me, it's almost like the emotion is the string, and then I'm just pulling and pulling and pulling at it until I get the character, and then the language, and then the style, and then all these other elements almost come
Yeah.
come out of it. And so for me, it's almost granted that because the emotion is the base of the work, the character is not the base of my work. The
Mm.
language, I love language, and language almost comes primary in the work, but at the base of the work, at the core of my work, I always start with an emotion, and I'll think, okay, so I have this emotion of loneliness, but it would be cliche to put it in anyone. So, what if I wrote a story about a very popular porn actor who is struggling with loneliness? You know, it's something like that. I'm like, the most unexpected person, you know, I would, for example, get like the most social person you can think of. I would get, you know, it's almost like writing a story about a clown who is really sad, you know, or a clown who is dealing with depression. That's how I look at my story. So I'm like, okay, so I need to write a story around depression, but who is the best person, but also who is the most unexpected person. And so even in the Transfiguration, you know, I play around with the bus conductor, the tout, being the first person to ever call Rhoda a woman. Sorry, to ever call Rhoda madame, because I'm like, this is the least unexpected thing. This is the least unexpected place where this kind of gender validation will come from. And yet that is where it comes from. And then the religious person who is meant to be tolerant, who is meant to love everyone equally, blah, 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 becomes the antagonistic force in the story, who is like, oh, no, I don't even want you to sit near my child. And so that's how I look at, you know, the form. And I'm like, okay, how do I play with this emotion in a way that is like, I think even in like Martha's story, Sunset Dreams, you know, I wanted to play around with the idea of letting go, but also how do we not let go? You know, everyone is always saying, let go, let go. You know, when someone dies, everyone is like, oh, you should move on. You know, after a while, move on. But what if you don't move on? What if there's no moving on? What if there's nothing to move on to? And so that's kind of how I wanted to play with it. Yeah.
I'm looking at the time. We are already a little bit over our normal time, but may I ask to read the last incoming questions, and then we round
please.
up, and we also have to choose our winners here for the books.
Okay.
So one of the last questions you quote, to quote you, no single human is eternally sad. Even the darkest hour of the night hold the promise of that. So how come so how come there is a little happiness as beautiful as they are?
I mean, grief is something that almost exists everywhere around us. Sadness is something that exists almost. More people are sad than more people are happy. That's just a fact of life. You know? there's more sad people out of the 7 billion people in the world. There's more people who are sad on a daily average basis. As Milan Kundera says, you know, happiness is the search for repetition. You know, you do something and it makes you happy, and you want to kind of always repeat it, and that's why man struggles to be happy, because you try to recreate these experiences that made you happy or something, but you cannot. And so for me, I did not look at them as like, oh, I need to have a balance of happiness and grief. No. I was just like, if someone is going through this, what would be the natural course of their life? What would they genuinely feel? And it goes back to what I was saying. I just want to write stories as honestly and as truthfully as possible. I don't concern myself with like trying to balance a story or trying to make a story feel good just for the sake of it. If someone is grieving, they're grieving. That's it. If someone is searching for their gender identity and they're facing opposition, and that's it. You know, maybe if I write another book and that's the space where I want to explore happiness, then that will be it. But I think there's often the burden, and it's mostly placed on the African writer, you know, to write happy certain kind of stories. And yes, we need happy stories, but like that's okay. There's books that explore that, and I always urge people to read those books. You know, go read Baba Segi's wives and laugh, from that. And, that's genuinely one of my favorite books of all time, because I'm like, I can escape to that. But at the same time, there's Ghana Must Go, and it's heavy, and it's, and all of this. And that's also something that we need to aspire to. So, a book cannot achieve everything. A book only seeks to achieve what the author wants to achieve with it. And if, for me, my idea was to get into this book and explore grief and loss and loneliness and longing in that way, then that is what I intended to achieve with this book. If for the next book I want to achieve the goal of exploring happiness and writing about happiness in a way that makes me that makes everyone feel like, oh, I've read a happy book, and that is what I will explore.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Last questions we have, and then we have to round up and draw our winners. Maybe can try to answer short.
Yeah.
I also saw that a number of stories were first published years ago, and they first published years ago, and they remain exactly the same. Do you think there is a value in reviewing the story when publishing, or do you feel your oldest stories were as perfect as it could be?
Some stories remain the same, some stories change. I'm a very slow writer, so it takes me, I think the shortest time it took me to write a short story in here was about 4 months, and that is Black is the Color of Absence, which is the shortest story in the collection as well. And so for me, I think if I've spent time like that writing a story and going over it and going and combing through it, I mean, even editorially, there was very little that was done to the work. I had already, and I suppose that's where my editorial practice comes in and helps a lot. I'd already been able to get to a point where I'm like, okay, I know where the bolts and nuts should, how to tie them and tighten them, and I know how to, dot my I's and cross my T's. And so for me, I think the stories almost remain the same as a consequence of them taking me so long to write. And so if you're that kind of writer who writes very slowly and goes over everything over and over again, then that's fine. The stories can remain the same. There's no value added to me in having my story completely rewritten. I'd rather just write a new short story and include it in the collection rather than trying to remodel a very old short story. There were a lot of short stories that were old, and I didn't even put them into consideration. I chose stories that I thought these are the strongest and they represent my work in the strongest way. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this answer. And
Yeah.
I still see so Kiswa, maybe, I don't know, so Kiswa, you're still there, but I see you struggling to connect with the audio. Maybe you can just, if it's possible, to see if we can see you again on the camera picture. If not, I'm very sorry, Sukiswa. Sukiswa, we're missing your voice and we're missing your laugh as well.
Yeah, I am. I end up in
Yeah.
passion. All
Okay.
right. So yes,
Good.
guys, this is the book to win today, and Detlef is about to do the draw. And I know that there are some people who haven't yet received their copies of the last two books. I apologize for Layla's book because it was actually sent through, but you should get it before the first Virtually Yours of 2024,
Yay.
where we're going to kick off with Abu Bakr Adam Ibrahim. You should get it then because I just got it sent from Lagos. Yeah, so please be patient with us. Anytime, we haven't forgotten you. Our silence is not trying to rob you.
Good. Then I can start with the draw.
Absolutely, Detlef.
Okay. So the first name is Nicole Gray. Nicole, you can unmute yourself. She was still here 2 minutes ago. I hope she's still there. Ah, maybe she's out, but she was there the whole time. I think we can leave
Email
that
her.
thing. Yeah, she was just 2 minutes ago. I still saw her. Oh, she left, TJ. She said she left, but she was there till nearly at the end. Second one, Linda Vere. Linda, you just asked the question. You can unmute yourself just for a second.
Oh, do I win a book?
Yes, Linda,
Yes.
you win a book.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic.
Where,
So happy to
where
hear
does
that.
where does the book go to? To which country? Which city?
Kenya, Nairobi.
Oh,
Kenya,
Linda,
Nairobi.
if you're in Kenya, just I will tell Prestige Books, and so just go to Prestige Books on Mamangina Street in Nairobi,
Yeah.
and they will
Yeah.
give you a copy of For What Are Butterflies Without Wings.
Okay, thank you so much.
The third book. Yeah. Okay. The third book goes to is it Tulonga or Tulenga and Yengu? Tulonga. You can unmute yourself. I think you are from Namibia. Is this correct? Maybe he can just hear, but I think he wrote Tulenga won the third book. That book goes to Namibia. Actually, to Windhoek. That's the only city, like you have learned last time. The only city in Namibia.
Capital Village.
The next one, the fourth book goes to Francisca Obeiro. Francisca.
Hi. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, congratulations.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. I managed to unmute myself. Thank you so much. It's too longer.
Tulonga,
Yeah.
congratulations.
Yes, and Troy, you are really an inspiration. I was just praying actually to get a copy.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you got a copy.
Thank you so much.
All right.
So, and the last book. The last book.
Where's Tulonga joining us from?
Yes, today I'm joining you from Windhoek. I'm actually based in a small village called Onalunike in Namibia.
Okay.
But for internet connectivity, I decided to be in the city.
My sister, you can't be saying you're based in a small village. Windhoek is a village.
Oh, yes. Thank you for that.
Where's Linda based? Not Linda. There was someone else who won the book. Francisca.
I'm in
I think she's
Nairobi.
from
Okay,
Nairobi. Yes.
Nairobi as well.
Mm.
Yeah, Linda is in Nairobi.
Okay.
So, and the last one goes to Shemaine Azinal. Shemaine.
Yay.
Shemaine, you can unmute yourself. So while maybe she still managed to unmute, I can tell you we had now listeners from Kampala, at least 3. We had people from the US, and we had another from US from New York, and that person sends greeting to Sunyati, and the person loves your book. So congratulations to Sue. We had people that joined us from Switzerland, from Nairobi, as you have heard. We had at least 2 from Windhoek, and from Ivory Coast, from Joburg, and from Kiambu from Kenya as well. So I'm still missing people from Nigeria, but teacher is in the US, so that's why there's nobody from Nigeria.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Wow.
Proceed.
So I
Wow.
think
The violence.
I think that was the longest virtual yours ever we had. It's already
Yay.
20 minutes past 7 here in Namibia. So I think we have to round up and close the virtual yours session for 2023. As you have heard from Sukiswa, we will have virtually yours in 2024 again. We start in March with Abu Bakr. Um, I would
Yeah.
before I start the music, Sukiswa, I would give you the last word.
I
Um,
really don't have. Okay, well, I always have the last word. Firstly, I'm going to give you a bit of a run on who we're having for the last for next year, so that you look forward to it. We are going to have Abu Bakr Adam Ibrahim. We are going to have Potataone Moen from Botswana. We are going to have Femi Kayode. At least that's my wish list. From Namibia, because Detlef says he's not in Nigeria, therefore he's not Nigerian. Uh, we're gonna have Beata Umbie Marei, we're gonna have Farai Mudzingwa, and we shall end up with Angela Makwala. So it's gonna be a lit year, guys.
Great.
wow.
Great. So,
We are
so
looking
thank
forward.
so, but thank you very much, Sukiswa. Even though you had problems at the beginning, we still had your love at the end, at least. And thank you very much, Troy, for these wonderful sessions. At at the beginning, we started with music from the streets of Nairobi, and I would like to finish the year with music with the streets from Windhoek. So I hope we will see us all next year for the 27th session of Virtually Yours.